We have fundamentally misdiagnosed the clinical reality of silence. Society categorizes a child's quietness as a developmental void, a psychological vacuum that must be aggressively invaded and immediately cured. But here is the brutal physical reality. This stillness is not a cognitive deficit or a lagging response time. It is an exceedingly rare state of hyper-cognitive processing. Our culture demands immediate, high-decibel acoustic output. We are executing a silent extraction on these high-fidelity brains, forcing them to generate noise that satisfies a rigid social metric. This actively traumatizes a finely calibrated nervous system. It systematically blinds the most precise observers within our population. Watch closely how they react. A 7-year-old sits at a chaotic family dinner table. An uncle points a finger straight across the wood surface. He demands at a high volume, "Why are you always so quiet?" In less than 1/10 of a second, the child's nervous system overrides. It forces an immediate physical freeze state. Their ocular movements track with terrifying speed, first locking onto the contracting muscles between the uncle's eyebrows, then instantly snapping to the strained, apologetic smile plastered on the mother's face. The somatic defense grid completely takes over. The child's shoulders elevate unnaturally high toward the ears. Their hands grip the raw underside of the wooden chair. The knuckles bleed out all color due to the extreme mechanical force. Their baseline respiratory pattern is instantly severed. It shifts into shallow, rapid micro-movements restricted entirely to the upper chest cavity. They drop their head, smashing their line of sight into the ceramic plate. They squeeze a barely audible vibration from the back of their throat. I do not know, and it gets worse. The actual fatal mechanism is the severe cognitive overdrive happening behind the eyes. Within that exact same second of perceived blankness, their cortex is simultaneously tracking and dismantling 3 overlapping adult conversations, isolating the precise acoustic hostility in the uncle's syllables, while concurrently processing the rhythmic barking of a dog 3 houses down the street. Why does a biological structure engineered for apex environmental detection attack itself? How is it manipulated by its surroundings until it misinterprets its own operational baseline as a fatal, sickening genetic flaw? Silence is absolutely not a lack of social desire. It is not a behavioral defect requiring immediate clinical correction. It is a highly specialized evolutionary adaptation. These nervous systems are physically constructed with a distinct architecture. They possess low threshold sensory processing channels, calibrated specifically to capture extreme densities of environmental data. The actual fatal mechanism lies deep within the Ascending Reticular Activating System, bound by the rigid physics of neurobiology. The so-called quiet nervous system operates on a terrifyingly high baseline of cortical arousal. This means they require zero high-frequency external stimulation to boot up. Microscopic environmental inputs push them instantly to peak cognitive velocity. Loud, rapid-fire environments do not engage them. The data overflow acts like blunt force trauma. It shatters their sensory defense protocols in a microsecond, shoving them violently into a state of excruciating neurological overload. And it gets worse. A brutal structural war is waged inside the prefrontal cortex. The behavioral inhibition system holds absolute dominance over the neural pathways. It ruthlessly severs the dopamine-driven behavioral activation circuits. This is not introversion. It is a hardwired biological directive. Before any physical limb moves or a vocal cord vibrates, the system forces a mandatory stop and check protocol. The brain must harvest every single environmental variable in the visual field. It must execute all predictive models at maximum speed. It must exhaust every potential physical and social liability. If there is even a 1% margin of unknown deviation in the logic chain, the circuitry completely locks down the vocal apparatus. It prohibits any reckless physical output. Watch closely how they react. Inside a third-grade classroom, a math teacher writes an equation on the chalkboard. The microsecond, the chalk leaves the slate. 3 children violently hurl their arms into the air. One lifts their pelvis entirely off the plastic chair, accompanied by frantic torso oscillations and high decibel yelling. The quiet child stares unblinking at the board. Within 4 seconds, their cortex has completely dismantled the equation. They even isolate a secondary numerical sequence hidden at the bottom. But their hands remain perfectly flat on the cold laminate desk. Not a single digit shifts its physical coordinates. The teacher spins around and demands an answer at a high volume. The quiet child's jaw muscles instantly clamp down. Their elbows retract inward with subtle, calculated force, pinning tightly against the bottom edge of their ribcage. They are executing extreme physical compression to shrink their spatial footprint, attempting to evade the unpredictable velocity of sudden attention. But adults arrogantly misread this biomechanical process. Authority figures downgrade this ultimate neurological discipline, labeling it as slow processing, apathy, or developmental delay. They initiate forced extroversion protocols, forcing these children to tear apart their neural baselines just to speak loudly. This facilitates absolutely zero learning. It merely triggers a chronic pathological, physiological stress response. But here is the brutal physical reality. When this biological baseline collides with a social architecture, a structure designed to ruthlessly penalize silence, the brain is forced to execute a bloody amputation, choosing between authentic neurological functioning and basic physical survival. Once silence is subjected to this extreme environmental extortion, it ceases to be a baseline biological state. It mutates into a highly energy-draining trauma response, traded purely for basic survival and baseline safety. The actual fatal mechanism is the underlying endocrine storm, the daily environmental mandate to project loud verbal output. This sustained, pathological social pressure directly forces the hypothalamic-Pituitary-Adrenal axis into overdrive. The brain cannot distinguish between this social command and a lethal predator. It translates the forced extroversion mimicry directly into a catastrophic, base-level survival threat. The nervous system spirals out of control. Cortisol floods the bloodstream in massive, unregulated spikes. This chronic, highly toxic cortisol saturation acts like battery acid. It physically corrodes the structural integrity of the hippocampus, completely dismantling the physical hubs for memory consolidation and emotional regulation. And it gets worse. To survive this state of absolute biological terror, the child's nervous system triggers a terminal defense protocol, a pathological fawning and compliance response. The prefrontal cortex executes a merciless override. It actively suppresses all authentic expression pathways, forcing the physical body to mimic the rigid behavioral scripts of extroverts. This relentless neurological masquerade is highly lethal. It drains the brain's glucose reserves at an unsustainable velocity, leading to severe physical cognitive depletion, and ultimately, a disastrous flattening of all emotional effect. Watch closely how they react. A teenager is shoved into a chaotic, highly competitive brainstorming session. They tighten their core and lean their upper body forward. Their throat constricts as they say, "Sorry to bother everyone," attempting to inject a critical structural optimization into the dialogue. The moment the vocal cords vibrate, their heart rate violently spikes. The pulsation of the carotid artery becomes visible to the naked eye. Subcutaneous capillaries dilate rapidly, forming a massive, pathological red flush across the neck. At that exact second, a peer with a naturally high vocal volume interrupts, erasing the teenager's sentence with a wave of loud, illogical filler words. The teenager's vocal cord vibrations instantly flatline. Their cervical spine begins to nod at an unnaturally high frequency, feigning absolute agreement with the hostile verbal override. Their spine immediately collapses backward, pressing hard into the chair. Both arms cross tightly over the chest cavity, forming a strict physical barricade. They sever every single idea, generating circuit inside their brain, using this extreme physical retreat to forcibly neutralize any potential conflict in the room. This chronic pathological suppression of the self eventually metastasizes into treating an apology as an identity. It is a terminal psychological prison with no physical walls. The individual preemptively assassinates their own physical and logical presence, long before external critique even manifests, resulting in irreversible self-erasure and total identity fragmentation. But here is the brutal physical reality. This localized self-erasure scales up infinitely over time, manufacturing a terrifying filtration system within the adult world. The most precise, lucid minds in the human population are structurally and permanently exiled from the epicenter of power. The physical foundation of modern social architecture has been entirely rewritten, from standardized classrooms to open-plan corporate zones. Everything is forcibly chained to a metric of instant acoustic output. This system executes a highly efficient structural purge, ruthlessly starving the brains that rely on high fidelity, delayed processing. The actual fatal mechanism is the cognitive shortcut of the human collective. Group dynamics operate on a severely deformed immediacy heuristic. Human biology generates a lethal miscalculation, directly equating the speed and decibel level of vocalization with absolute confidence and elite competence. This pathological biological feedback loop bypasses all fact-checking. It completely paralyzes the logical auditing of the actual data. And it gets worse. The quiet brain relies entirely on asynchronous processing. It must aggressively consume the global dataset, complete multi-dimensional cross-synthesis, and eliminate every fatal fallacy in the base logic. Only then will it issue a physical command to the vocal cords. This operational delay totally desynchronizes them from the group's dopamine-fueled feedback loop. The quiet individual's data silence is automatically mistranslated by the collective psychology as a malicious withholding of information or an intolerable display of incompetence. Watch closely how they react. Inside a hyper-anxious corporate crisis room, a manager with highly developed vocal muscles begins rapidly projecting superficial fixes. He paces erratically down the narrow carpeted aisle. His arms execute massive, meaningless physical sweeps through the air. The quiet employee sits completely immobilized in their chair, their spinal column locked into a perfectly vertical alignment, their optic nerve dead centered on the printed quarterly data. The tip of their black ballpoint pen traces a specific column of numbers with agonizingly slow precision. 10 minutes later, during a microscopic physical pause in the manager's oxygen intake, the quiet employee intervenes using a very low acoustic frequency. They pinpoint a fatal structural fracture at the base of the database architecture. The manager's auditory cortex completely rejects this audio signal. 5 minutes later, the manager weaponizes the exact same conclusion at a deafening volume. The entire room executes a highly synchronized pathological nodding motion. The quiet employee's eyelids blink twice at high speed. They lay the ballpoint pen perfectly flat against the wood grain. They rotate their skull, locking their gaze permanently onto the wall clock. This sustained exploitation guarantees severe professional subjugation. Brains possessing the highest strategic depth are structurally quarantined. The entire social apparatus plunges into a terminal downward spiral. We have completely eradicated deep, defensive problem-solving protocols, opting instead for a frantic reliance on highly destructive, delayed crisis management. But here is the brutal physical reality. If the physics of the commercial world are locked into a death spiral against the quiet mind, the only viable survival protocol is not to contort the brain, but to execute a cold, calculated, hostile takeover of the environment itself. Silence is absolutely not a pathological defect to be surgically removed. In a physical realm completely devoured by high-frequency noise, it is the ultimate neurological trait of an apex predator. The most fatal structural tragedy is not that the quiet child is denied the right to emit sound. It is that society is frantically blinding its own most precise watchman. The terminal objective of adulthood is never forcing the brain to scream. It is weaponizing this absolute physical stillness to command the space. True operational control is never dictated by the decibel output of vocal cords. It is generated by the inescapable gravitational pull of absolute stasis. But here is the brutal physical reality. You must immediately execute the neural processing reset protocol. Use absolute physical boundaries to forcibly dictate the tempo of the interaction. When a highly complex data request is hurled at you, lock your visual focus directly onto the center of their pupils. Force every somatic muscle into a state of absolute zero motion. Make time stop for 3 complete physical seconds. Then deliver an absolute assertion with a flat acoustic tone. I am analyzing these variables. I will output the final conclusion in 5 minutes. Do not sever visual contact at any point during this sequence. Do not attach any form of apology to the front or back of the sentence. And it gets worse. You must apply a structural chokehold to your environment. Cease depleting your glucose in illogical public debates. Actively seize the absolute choke points of critical information flow. Become the final data synthesizer, the architect, the ultimate auditor. Force those highly vocal, adrenaline-driven entities to shove their chaotic, unstructured data directly through your strictly controlled physical auditing channel. Prohibit all physical action until they receive your logical clearance. The entity using high volume to dominate spatial territory is rarely the most lethal threat in the room, if you are ready to stop apologizing for a hyper-calibrated nervous system and prepare to use your absolute tempo to re-hijack physical reality. Subscribe to this channel. Our simulation has only just begun.